Beverly Glenn had been teaching voice for 15 years when she walked into Hitsville Studio A that morning in September 1972. She had studied at Juilliard, performed opera in 3 countries, and trained dozens of technically proficient singers. When Motown hired her as a vocal consultant, she arrived with textbooks, breathing exercises, and an unshakable belief that there was a right way and a wrong way to use the human voice. She was about to discover that Marvin Gaye didn't care about either. The cassette had been playing for less than 30 seconds when Beverly stopped it. Her hand moved to the pause button with surgical certainty. In the control room, 3 engineers looked at each other. Nobody stopped Marvin Gaye's playback. Not Berry Gordy, not the Funk Brothers. Certainly not a vocal coach who'd been on the payroll for 6 days. But Beverly Glenn wasn't listening as a fan. She was listening as a diagnostician. And what she heard was a catalog of technical violations. The voice was too close to the microphone. The breathing was shallow and irregular. The pitch wavered where proper support would have locked it in. And worst of all, Marvin was whispering, deliberately avoiding the full resonance of his instrument. "This will destroy his vocal cords within 5 years," Beverly said to the room. "He's straining. He's not using proper technique. This isn't singing. This is damage in progress." One of the engineers, a man named Steve, who had been recording Marvin for 3 years, smiled, not unkindly but with the patience of someone who had seen this movie before. "Maybe you should tell him that yourself," Steve said, which is how Beverly Glenn found herself sitting across from Marvin Gaye in a rehearsal room 3 days later, her notebook open, her credentials on display, ready to fix a problem that Marvin didn't know he had. Marvin arrived 20 minutes late, wearing sunglasses indoors, moving with unhurried grace. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply sat down on the piano bench and waited. "Mr. Gaye," Beverly began, her voice carrying formal precision, "I've reviewed your recent recordings, and I need to be direct. Your technique is going to damage your voice. You have a 4-octave range, but you're singing like you're afraid of it. The whispering, the lack of support, the inconsistent breath control. These aren't artistic choices. These are technical mistakes that will shorten your career." Marvin said nothing. He was looking at her, or at least his face was pointed in her direction. The sunglasses made it impossible to know where his eyes actually were. Beverly continued, "Proper vocal technique requires projection. It requires breath support from the diaphragm, not the throat. It requires using the full resonance of your vocal chambers. What you're doing is the equivalent of a pianist playing with 2 fingers when they have 10 available." She waited for a response, for defensiveness, for the ego she had been warned about. Instead, Marvin reached up slowly and removed his sunglasses. His eyes were tired but focused. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that Beverly had to lean forward to hear him. "Can I show you something?" Beverly's instinct was to say no. She was here to teach, not to be taught. But something in the way Marvin asked, in the complete absence of challenge or ego in his voice, made her pause. "Of course," she said. Marvin stood and walked to the microphone stand in the center of the room. He adjusted it, bringing it down to an unusual height, then moved it closer. Much closer. Close enough that when he positioned himself, the microphone was less than 2 inches from his mouth. He turned to Steve, who had set up the recording equipment for this session. "Turn everything off except this one mic. No reverb, no compression, no room sound, just the capsule and me." Steve looked at Beverly. She nodded, curious now despite herself. Marvin closed his eyes. He didn't do vocal warm-ups. He didn't run scales. He didn't do any of the preparatory work that Beverly had spent 15 years teaching singers to do before they attempted to perform. He simply began to sing. But singing wasn't the right word for what happened next. Marvin's voice entered the room at a volume barely above conversation. He was singing the first verse of "Let's Get It On," but he wasn't performing it. He was whispering it, breathing it, letting each word leave his mouth with the intimacy of a secret shared in darkness. Beverly heard things she had never heard in a vocal performance before. She heard the texture of Marvin's tongue against his teeth on the word healing. She heard the slight click of his throat between phrases, the wet sound of lips parting before baby. She heard the breath entering and leaving his lungs, shallow and irregular, in a way that her training said was wrong, but her body understood was human. She heard the tiny imperfections in his pitch that should have been flaws but somehow weren't. Little drifts downward that felt like falling, like surrender, like letting go. The technical part of her brain screamed violations. His breathing was inconsistent, pulling air in strange places, holding it when he should release. His pitch drifted flat on certain words, a quarter tone below where it should land. He had no projection, no power, no proper resonance. Every rule she had spent 15 years teaching was being ignored, deliberately bypassed as if technique itself was the enemy of what he was trying to communicate. But Beverly Glenn, the woman who existed before the training and the degrees and the certainty, the woman who had first fallen in love with music because it made her feel something she couldn't name, heard something else entirely. She heard a voice that wasn't singing to a room. It was singing to a single person, to one set of ears, to someone lying in the dark inches away, close enough to feel breath on skin, close enough that the boundary between singer and listener dissolved into something that wasn't performance anymore, but communion. Every technique violation was intentional. The shallow breathing created vulnerability. The lack of projection created intimacy, forcing the ear to lean in, to close the distance. The pitch variations created humanity, reminded the listener. This wasn't a perfect instrument, but a person trying to reach another person across an impossible gap. Marvin wasn't avoiding proper technique because he didn't know it. He was transcending it because he knew something that Beverly's textbooks had never taught her. Something that couldn't be taught because it lived in the space between what you learned and what you understood. He was singing to the part of a person that technique couldn't reach, the part that didn't care about perfect pitch or proper breathing or projection, the part that only wanted to know, are you real? Are you here with me? Can you close this distance? When the verse ended, Marvin opened his eyes and looked at Beverly. He didn't ask if she understood. He didn't need to. Her face had already answered. How are you doing that? Beverly's voice came out smaller than she intended. Marvin walked back to the piano bench and sat down. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of something he had figured out alone, in the dark, without a teacher to guide him. I'm not singing to the room, he said quietly. I'm singing to one person who's not here. Someone I'm trying to reach across a distance, across time, across whatever space exists between two people who want to be closer than they are. If I project, if I use proper technique, if I fill the room with sound the way you're trained to do, she'll hear a performance. She'll hear someone showing off their instrument, demonstrating their skill. But if I whisper, if I get this close, he gestured to where the microphone had been, she'll hear me, not my voice, me, the person underneath the sound. He paused, looking down at his hands. You asked me how I'm doing this, but that's the wrong question. The question is, what am I trying to do? And the answer is, I'm trying to make someone feel less alone. That's all music is, really. It's one person telling another person, I feel this too. You're not the only one. And you can't do that from a distance. You can't do that with perfect technique and proper projection. You have to get close, close enough that they can hear you breathing, close enough that they know you're real. Beverly sat in silence. In her notebook, she had written 17 technical corrections, breathing exercises, pitch exercises, projection drills. The accumulated wisdom of 15 years, all designed to make singers more powerful, more precise, more technically proficient. None of it mattered. They didn't teach this at Juilliard, she said finally. Marvin smiled. It was a sad smile, the smile of someone who had learned something difficult and couldn't unlearn it. They can't teach what I'm doing, he said, because what I'm doing isn't about the voice. It's about what the voice is trying to say when words aren't enough. Beverly Glenn left that rehearsal room and sat in her car in the Hitsville parking lot for 40 minutes, listening to the cassette Steve had given her. She listened 3 times, and with each listen, she heard more clearly what she had missed in 15 years of training singers. Technique was meant to serve emotion, not the other way around. Power without purpose was just noise. Precision without feeling was just mathematics. And sometimes the most technically incorrect choice was the only honest one. 2 weeks later, Beverly submitted a formal letter to Motown. She wouldn't be continuing as a vocal consultant, not because she disagreed with their methods, but because she needed to rethink everything she thought she knew about what a voice was for. She didn't quit music. Instead, she started working with R&B singers in a different capacity, not as a teacher of technique, but as what she called an intimacy consultant. She helped singers find the emotional truth in their performances, even if it meant breaking every technical rule she had once held sacred. She taught them to listen to the space between notes, to understand that silence could be as powerful as sound. She showed them how to use imperfection as an instrument, how a crack in the voice at the right moment could communicate more than a perfectly executed run ever could. Word spread quietly through the industry. Within 2 years, Beverly was working with some of the biggest names in soul and R&B, teaching them not how to sing properly, but how to sing honestly, how to use imperfection as a tool, how to choose vulnerability over power when the song demanded it, how to remember that every song is a conversation, and in a real conversation, you don't perform, you connect. She started keeping a notebook of what she called honest mistakes, moments when singers broke technical rules in ways that served the emotional truth of the song, a breath taken in the wrong place that created tension, a note that cracked under the weight of the lyric, a phrase that fell flat but felt true. These weren't mistakes to be corrected. They were choices to be understood and, when appropriate, repeated. In 1976, during an interview for a music education journal, Beverly was asked about the moment that changed her approach to vocal coaching. She didn't hesitate. Marvin Gaye sang one verse for me, just one, and in those 2 minutes, he destroyed 15 years of certainty. He showed me that the rules exist to give you structure, but real artistry happens when you know exactly which rules to break and why. Classical training teaches you to sing to everyone in the room. Marvin taught me that sometimes you need to sing to the one person who isn't there. Marvin Gaye never knew the full impact of that session. He never knew that Beverly restructured her entire career because of what he showed her. He never knew that dozens of singers who came after him were taught to embrace intimacy over power because a vocal coach questioned everything she thought she knew. But his voice knew. That whisper, that breath, that technically imperfect choice that became the signature of an entire genre, knew exactly what it was doing. It was reaching across the space between two people. It was making distance disappear. It was proving that sometimes the most powerful thing a voice can do is make itself small enough to slip past every defense and land directly in the place where technique can't follow. In that rehearsal room in 1972, Beverly Glenn came to teach Marvin Gaye how to sing properly. Instead, she learned that proper was just another word for safe. And Marvin Gaye had never been interested in safe. He was interested in true. And truth, she discovered, doesn't care about technique.